The bus shelter was a thin island of light under a bruised sky. Snow came down in small, stubborn flakes that clung to hair and mittens and the cuff of Elliot's coat. He stood with his hands braced on the stroller bar, as if steadying something larger than himself, the world that had narrowed to the width of a child's breath and a funeral photograph in his pocket. Laya hummed a tune under her breath, toes packed into her boots, watching the woman on the bench with the solemn attention children give to stray birds. The woman's hair was damp at the temples, a tote sagging beside her, a scarf wrapped once, carelessly, around her throat. She looked like someone who had been told to keep going and, for a long while, had obeyed. If you like stories like this one and want more gentle, human tales, stay with us until the end and consider subscribing to Soul Stirring Stories, a small invitation to carry these moments forward. It helps more people find stories about kindness and second chances. Elliot watched the woman because children watch everything that matters. Laya's small hand found his knee and squeezed. "Daddy," she said, the quiet kind that could be mistaken for a question. "Why is she sitting on the cold like that?" Elliot closed his eyes for a fraction of a heartbeat and counted, the way he had learned to when grief came back in waves. One breath to steady, one breath for Laya, one breath to meet the world again. He had rehearsed a dozen answers for strangers who needed to be guarded against or helped away. Lines that said care without invitation. He opened his eyes and settled on something practical. "She might be waiting for a bus," he said. It was the sort of answer a man who had learned the costs of misreading strangers could give. Laya tilted her head and regarded the woman as if measuring a question. "She looks tired," she said. "Her coat is wet. Her hands are bare." The bus arrived with a sigh and a rumble, doors folding open like an exhale. People stepped onto the slick steps, stamped their feet, left a warm cloud in the air. The woman remained, shoulders bent slightly forward, watching the stream of faces as if something in them might change. After the bus left, Laya slipped off the stroller seat and walked to the bench as naturally as reaching for a toy. Elliot went after her, the world narrowing again. His daughter, a stranger, the city's cold. "Hi," Laya said, because that was what she did, greet the quiet. The woman looked up. Her eyes were the color of late winter tea, rimmed with a tiredness that was not only physical. There was work in them, an old craft that had been broken long ago and kept alive by habit. She smiled finally, a small, surprised thing. "Hello," she answered, voice roughened by cold and disuse. "You need a mommy," Laya announced, with the certainty children have for propositions beyond argument. The woman laughed, soft and unused. Elliot felt an odd climbing warmth in his chest and braced himself. "No, she began, and then let the sentence hang like steam. Laya took off one mitten and offered it like a sullen treaty. "I need a mommy," she said again, pressing the token into the woman's palm. The woman's hand closed around the mitten as though around a warm coin. For a moment, she became a child in a foreign room, surprised by the bravery of small hands. "That's very kind," she said. "My name is Isabel." Elliot, who had been standing just behind them, like a silent field, said, "I'm Elliot. This is Laya." He kept his tone guarded, but softer than he might have years ago. He glanced at the tote, at the scarf trailing on the bench. He thought of the tote at the small apartment 2 blocks away. A kitchenette that still held the smell of cinnamon from Sunday pancakes. A guest room with a blanket folded on the spare bed, and a father who had bought too many cast-off hopes since the funeral. Isabel looked at the stroller, at the small boots poking under its edge. She looked at Elliot's hands, the ones that did dishes and bandaged scraped knees and folded school lunches with practiced care. "You shouldn't be alone out here," Elliot said, before he could rein the words in. "It's freezing." Isabel's smile was a half-twist, an acknowledgement of reality rather than acceptance. "I'm managing," she said. There was a lot packed into managing. A timetable of small rationings, a stack of routines learned to survive, a face hardened against asking. Elliot could sense the danger of asking too much, but he also felt the pull of the child beside him. Laya tugged on his sleeve to remind him that some things were not negotiable. "Come have something warm," he said, "for a little while. I can't let my daughter give away mittens to strangers if they might freeze." Isabel hesitated, the habit of distrust like a physical reflex. Then she stood and collected the tote as if it were a map of where she had been and where she refused to go next. She kept the scarf close, fingers worrying the frayed edge. On the walk to Elliot's apartment, snow scraped against their coats, and the city felt muffled, as if careful kindness had pressed a hand against the noise. Inside, the apartment had the soft, governed disorder of a household, a father and a daughter. Crayon drawings of animals lined the refrigerator, taped with proud asymmetry. A small wooden chair had a sticky ring at its edge, from juice spilled and forgiven. Elliot moved with the economy of someone who had become expert at making the small things safer. Latches on cabinets, a basket of shoes at the door, a blanket always within reach. Laya led Isabel to the small living room and perched on the arm of the couch as if it were a throne. "You'll like my soup," she promised. "It's carrot and ginger. It helps with cold." Laya's recipes were transactions of comfort, words that came with action. Isabel watched the way Laya pronounced helps, and something loosened in her, like a stitch pulling free. Elliot ladled soup into a mismatched bowl and put a mug of tea in front of Isabel with hands that did not tremble. He watched for signs, the woman's fingers, whether they shook, whether she ate. Isabel lifted the spoon like someone reacquainting herself with flavor. The steam carried cinnamon and something woodsy, maybe a bay leaf Elliot had tucked in out of habit. These small, ordinary things felt sacred in the way of people who had learned to celebrate safety. When Isabel smiled at the first bite, it was a small, private sun. Laya clapped 2 small hands. "See," she announced, "I told you." Over the next days, the pattern established itself like a found rhythm. Isabel sat in the corner of the living room with a battered sketchbook, hands raw from the weather but careful with pencil and thread. Laya brought blankets and badges of approval. Elliot treated Isabel's presence like a piece of fragile glass. He kept it on the table but wrapped it in napkins. He asked how she was, and then, worse and better, he listened. She told awkward, elliptical things at first, that she had designer's hands, that she once worked with fabric which could sing under the right needle, that some years ago the world had been different. She flinched at certain questions and changed the subject with the skill of someone who had practiced evasion as a form of self-protection. Isabel's clothing bore quiet evidence of her history. A seam mended many times, a pair of boots well sanded from long walking, a scarf abandoned by its full color. Hidden in the tote was a roll of printed clippings, articles folded and refolded until the edges softened into rumor. Elliot noticed them when he helped unpack a bag of donated toiletries and a small packet of herbal tea she had tucked away like contraband. The headline he glimpsed as he set the items aside had the clipped cadence of accusation and loss. Not detailed, but public. The sort of article that rearranged a life and left a person needing to learn how to exist again. Elliot did what his cautiousness allowed. He made a list, appointments for a check at the clinic. The nurse would check dehydration and offer a pamphlet about local services, a call to a social worker recommended by a church outreach, a small withdrawal from his account to send to a shelter he trusted if Isabel said she wanted that. He offered what he could without making a show of rescue. Isabel accepted the clinic visit because Laya insisted, and because the warmth of a waiting room felt like an undertow pulling her toward being seen. At the clinic, the physician was practical and measured. She asked about sleep, about last meals, about any ongoing prescriptions, and when Isabel hesitated on the subject of insurance, the doctor asked the question like one might ask about allergies: necessary, clinical, not judgmental. A nurse wrapped a clean bandage around a small abrasion on Isabel's forearm. The wound looked like a memory, a pale line beneath the skin rather than an event. Elliot watched Isabel's face as the nurse worked, close and distant at once, as if this small tending might be both a balm and an embarrassment. Afterwards, when they walked back through the pale army of falling flakes, Isabel carried a small clinic bag with a neatly folded flyer about a center that offered sewing classes and a line about legal aid. Laya pointed at the flyer like a child choosing a favorite picture. "You can make beautiful dresses," she declared. "You can make me a twirly skirt." Isabel's eyes softened at the idea, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to dream for a moment. Elliot watched that flicker and felt it like heat under the ribs, the dangerous, necessary warmth that could either burn or mend. Yet there were fissures. Some nights, Isabel watched the apartment doors as if memorizing how far she could be let in without being asked for too many things. She kept her tote close, sleeping lightly on a futon Laya claimed as Isabel's bed after the first night. Elliot, who measured risk in silence, found himself searching for evidence that this would not fracture him or his daughter. He Googled discreetly at 2 a.m., a modern ritual of snooping and reasoning. A name, an old headline, a picture from years ago when the woman in the story had been celebrated for a collection that folded fabric into spells. The articles he found were careful and impersonal. The comments beneath them were crueler, quiet digital stones thrown at someone whose fall had been made public. He thought of his wife's funeral and the way rumors had circled like flies then, small cruelties that compounded grief. He did not want Laya exposed to more of that. He also watched the way Laya cradled Isabel's hand when the woman sat too still, and how Laya drew pictures of homes with 3 stick figures and a heart above the roof. Children have a ruthless capacity for naming possibilities. Elliot's instinct was to protect that naming at all cost. One afternoon, when the stove hissed and Laya embroidered a paper crown with glued sequins, Isabel produced a length of fabric from her tote. It was indigo, hand-dyed, and when she spread it on the coffee table, the room seemed to inhale. She showed Laya how to thread a needle, guiding the small fingers with a patience that was steady and precise. The needle glinted in the light like a small, honest thing. Elliot watched their hands move, Laya's small, stubby fingers, Isabel's scarred but sure ones, and felt stitches forming between them that were not yet sewn to any guarantee. But kindness kept a breach as well. A friend of a friend sent Elliot a link to a forum thread where old gossip had been rehashed. A neighbor at the laundromat recognized Isabel's face from an old magazine and mentioned that scandal over a bag of quarter coins. The world outside their warm apartment liked answers that were simple and sharp, and it took a small, public stone to remind them that safety was fragile. The first time Isabel left, she left without explanation. Her tote was gone from the corner where it had settled into an unclaimed piece of furniture. The scarf she had kept wound about herself was not on the back of the couch. Laya cried for the missing mitten and for Isabel, both, and Elliot held his daughter like a small constellation. Isabel had said she needed time, that there were things to deal with alone. Elliot recognized the familiar economy of self-removal, the graceful exit people make to spare others the work of their pain. Part of him wanted to run after her, and part of him understood that sometimes a person needed to prove to themselves they could leave and return on their own terms. He found a note folded under a chipped mug on the kitchen counter. The handwriting was small and angular. It read, "I am sorry. I will call." It was both an apology and a promise. The words were not enough to seal the fracture, but they were a tether, and for several nights Elliot waited between his fingers like a small possibility. In the days that followed, the apartment felt like a room after guests have left, full of echoes. Laya asked about Isabel the way children ask about missing loved ones, small inquiries that demand simple answers. Elliot gave her what he could without lying. She had to do something, he said. We'll see her again. But his evenings were longer and filled with the low hum of worry. He checked his phone more often than seemed healthy. He walked the streets near the shelters and coffee shops where he thought she might go. He tried to balance patience with the urgency that lives in fathers who have learned loss. When Isabel did return, it was with a small packet wrapped in paper and string, something she placed on the table with hands that trembled only slightly. Inside was a strip of fabric, the indigo now embroidered with tiny stitches, and a note, "Thank you for the soup, for Laya, for letting me be near." Elliot felt both relief and an ache that had no clear name. The scarf, which had been frayed and alone, had been repaired with careful, deliberate stitches. He thought of the motif of hands in their small acts, repair, stirring soup, threading needles, and felt as if a new language had been taught to him in the margins of ordinary days. Still, the world pressed on. An article resurfaced with a photograph of Isabel from years before, and a commentator's cruel gleam found its way into a neighborhood feed. Someone left a folded piece of paper slid under their door with a question mark more accusing than curious. The city is like that, quick to notice and slow to soften.
Elliot found himself at a crossroads, taut with contradictory impulses. To press Isabel for answers would be practical prudence. To offer unconditional shelter would be the kind of risk that older grief had taught him to avoid. He watched the way Isabel withdrew into herself when she thought no one watched, how she sketched late at night with a light low and speechless. He saw in her the shape of someone trying to find a foothold after falling. When Laya announced at breakfast, between bites of toast, that she had given Isabel a name, Mommy Isabel, Elliot felt the ground shift. It was one thing for a child to invent warmth. It was another to let that invention set the terms of real life. "We can't call someone that unless they are our family," he said, softer than he had meant to. Laya's little face fell, the kind of thing that makes a father's chest hollow. Isabel, who had been half-turned from the window, looked up and smiled, a small, uncertain smile. "It's a good name," she said, "if she wants it." Elliot swallowed the rest of his sentence. He realized the question before him was not only about trust, but about what it meant to say yes to danger when yes could also mean mending. He thought of the scarf reframed in his living room, the small stitches visible like testimony, and the way Laya had hung a new drawing next to it: 3 stick figures, a heart, a crooked roof. That night, after he put Laya to bed and watched the small chest rise and fall with a steady rhythm that calmed him as nothing else did, Elliot sat at the kitchen table with the indigo fabric lying between his hands. The stitches were deliberate and imperfect, a map of someone's attempt to mend what had once been torn. He thought of his wife's hands and how they had sewn costumes for school plays until the night she stopped. He thought of the lonely rows of his own life since. He thought of what it would mean to offer the same small safety he had given his daughter to another adult who had been badly broken. He made a choice that felt like stepping onto thin ice. He would try to see Isabel whole, not only as someone with a public past, but as a person who could be taught to trust again. But to do that, he would have to allow the apartment to contain more risk and more grace than it had done in years. To do that, he would have to ask for help when help was needed, and to hold his daughter in the center of decisions rather than on the edge of their consequences. The next morning, they found an envelope on the doormat with a card inside. A note from an old mentor of Isabel's, a woman Elliot did not know. The card was brief, handwritten in a steady script. "If she returns, see her with your hands." This was not a permission, not quite, but it felt like a benediction. Elliot folded the card and slipped it into his wallet. He thought about how small guidance can feel like a light through a slit in the dark. He also knew that light could attract attention as well as warmth. He would have to guard the household like a harbor, open enough for boats to come in, steady enough to shelter them. Then, a week later, the front of the paper carried a short piece about a young designer who had quietly rebuilt a community program to teach sewing to people re-entering the workforce. The piece did not name names, and the photograph was anonymous, a hand mid-stitch. Laya clapped when she saw it and clutched her father's sleeve. "See," she said, "you were right." Elliot smiled then, because sometimes the world gave an answer that felt like a small blessing. He reached for his coat, for the scarf on the hook that had once belonged to his wife, and he felt the shape of the day like a promise. But even as he stepped outside into the city's pale light, he knew the terrain ahead was uncertain. There would be questions and reckonings, friends who did not understand, offers that arrived too late, and choices that would have consequences. He was, for the first time in a long while, willing to meet them. He was also, in the small, private place where memory met resolve, afraid. The city smelled of exhaust and melted snow, and the scarf around his neck smelled faintly of cinnamon from some kitchen they had shared. As he walked back toward the bus stop where months ago a woman's hands had accepted a mitten, he rehearsed what safety might mean: clear boundaries for Laya, invitations without pressure for Isabel, and a willingness to yield some control in exchange for human repair. When Isabel saw him coming, her face shifted: relief, worry, something like cautious hope. Laya ran ahead with the natural authority of a child who has brokered an adult's fate before. She reached Isabel and held up a small paper crown, glittering with glue and promise. "You're coming tonight to make soup," she declared. "You're mommy tonight if you want." For a breathless second, the world hesitated, and then leaned. Isabel's eyes shone with moisture she did not pretend to hide. "I'd like that," she said. The words were small, accurate, and luminous. Elliot stood aside and watched the two of them,
and in the corner of his eye he saw the indigo scarf draped over the back of a chair like a flag. He felt the slow stitch of something forming, awkward, uneven, insistently real. When Laya tugged at Isabel's sleeve and, with solemn conviction, said, "I need a mommy, and you need a home," the sentence landed between them like a key. Isabel's fingers closed around Laya's, and she bent forward to press her forehead to the child's small crown. It was a beginning, not a rescue, and it was not yet a promise. It was instead an offering of sorts, hands reaching across a table laden with soup and thread, the smell of warm bread on the air, and the quiet agreement that they would try. Outside, snow softened the city into a quilt.
Inside, as the kettle hissed and a clock marked the patient passage of ordinary minutes, Elliot realized that the work ahead would be less about fixing and more about keeping a space warm, keeping a hand out when one slipped, keeping a child's trust as the most fragile and necessary thing. He set down his cup and, without a dramatics, moved to the stove to stir the soup. Laya sat on the counter, legs swinging, and Isabel began to hum a little song under her breath as she threaded a needle. The song was unfamiliar and old-fashioned and had no words that Elliot could place, but its rhythm fit the room like weather. The scarf on the chair caught the morning light and held it, pale and good. None of them pretended the future would be easy. There would be inquiries and judgments, and there would be nights when fear returned like a chill. But for now, they had stitches, soup, a small crown, and a promise that someone would try to see the unseen. Elliot wiped his hands on a towel and looked at the two of them, at Laya's earnest face and Isabel's tentative smile. He had lost much in the last years, certainty, a life rearranged by sorrow, and yet he had also learned that some losses taught you where to place your hands. He decided, quietly, that he would keep his hands willing. Later that week came an invitation by way of a call from an old colleague of Isabel's, a gallery wanting to host a small showcase of recovered designers, a string of hopeful emails about community fashion shows, and the faint possibility of work if Isabel dared to try. Isabel listened to the call with an intensity that made Elliot think of the way people concentrate when they are about to re-enter a room they once loved. She turned to them after. "They want people who have a story," she said, "not just the clothes." Her voice was small. "They want the hands that mend." Laya clapped. "That's you," she said. Isabel shrugged, which was the movement of someone who had mastered both hope and self-protection. "Maybe," she said. "I'm not sure." Elliot thought of the indigo cloth, of the stitches that had saved a fragment of color. He thought of the gallery lights and the way light exposes as much as it reveals. He was aware of all the ways things could go wrong, the resurfacing of old headlines, the green-eyed curiosity of a world that likes scandal more than repair. He was also aware that if they did nothing, nothing would change. "We'll go," he said. "If you want." Isabel looked at him. For the first time since he'd met her, he could see her making a decision that was not a flight. "Okay," she said, and the syllable was modest and brave. The weeks that followed were a slow, patient work. Isabel sewed through afternoons, teaching Laya to make simple stitches and letting the girl's clumsy fingers learn the rhythm. Elliot sorted through contacts and gently clarified boundaries. They mended a patch on a school jacket, repaired a tear in the couch cushion, and framed the indigo strip for the wall,
not as art exactly, but as a reminder that small stitches matter. Then, one evening, an email arrived with a subject line that made Elliot's chest tighten, an invitation to an evening showcase. Isabel read it aloud at the kitchen table, the lamplight making the paper glow. Would you come?" she asked, and when Laya nodded with fierce certainty, Elliot realized that this was not only about fashion or public acknowledgement, it was about legitimacy reclaimed in a world that loved to label and neglect. He said yes before he could overthink it. The night of the event, he dressed in a coat that had seen better winters, Laya in a small dress with a crooked hem she had insisted on wearing, and Isabel in a blouse she had hemmed herself. The city hummed like a live wire as they stepped into the gallery where people gathered like moths for light. Inside, Isabel's work hung among others, a modest lineup of recovered fabrics and small statements. The room smelled faintly of polish and coffee, and something floral from a bouquet someone had placed near the entrance. A retired couple stood nearby, holding hands like a small bridge. A curator moved through the room with the efficient air of someone who liked to make introductions. Laya clutched a small paper crown in her fist. She had written a poem for Isabel on a napkin, words arranged with the frankness only children can muster. Elliot smoothed his palms against his coat and watched Isabel, whose face had a hunted softness that had learned to trust the presence of a small crowd in a new way. When the curator spoke about the work and how it represented stories of repair, Isabel's name was spoken in the sort of public cadence that turned her history into narrative rather than scandal. A hush passed over the room like the moment in which a seam is tied off. Then the microphone came to Laya because she had pushed her way forward without manners, and almost everyone smiled at the sight of a child demanding the center. "I wrote a poem," Laya announced. Her voice trembled at first and then found its own steady. She read about hands and soup, about a scarf that smelled of cinnamon, and a bed that held no more nightmares. At the end, she looked toward Isabel and said plainly, "I need a mommy, and you need a home." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Isabel stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a threshold she had not known how to cross. Elliot, who had been watching for the possible risks of exposure, felt his throat tighten. He understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with the lights and everything to do with the small human arrangements they had made, that being seen like this was both vulnerable and necessary. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "And like this was both vulnerable and necessary." Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Laya reached for Laya's hand, and Elliot saw the indigo fabric framed in the quiet corner of his mind, how it had been mended, then carried into public light. He reached into his inside pocket and felt the folded piece of paper, the mentor's card, and he slipped it into Isabel's palm before anyone else could speak. She looked at the card and then at Elliot. There was an exchange that did not require words, a pact, a simple agreement to try. The applause that followed was not thunderous, just a warm release, the sort that filled the room with a soft human noise. People came forward to ask about Isabel's technique, about Laya's poem. Someone asked if Isabel would teach a class. She answered carefully and with a steadiness that surprised her. Elliot, standing slightly behind, felt the shape of something changing under his feet, an interior tide that carried risk toward possibility. Later, on the walk home through the streets edged with melting snow, Laya's poem forgotten and re-remembered in her small voice, Elliot kept glancing at Isabel. She walked with a slow correctness, as if testing whether the city would accept her new step. He felt a tenderness toward her that was not romantic in the simple sense, but shaped by gratitude and the desire to protect what had been born between them, a small and fragile family. When they reached the apartment, he took the indigo strip from the back of his chair and framed it properly, placing it where light could meet it and where Laya could point to it and say, "See, we made this." Isabel sat at the kitchen table with a teacup and a new kind of quiet. Laya crowned her in papier-mâché and insisted on soup with extra ginger. Isabel, once hidden and wary, began to stitch in the evenings with a steadier hand. She taught Laya how to make a running stitch and showed Elliot how to knot off without tangles. Her scars, when they emerged at the curve of her wrist or the inside of her forearm, were treated with the same practical care Elliot used for scraped knees. A soft touch, an offer of a bandage, no questions that forced memory into speech. Still, Isabel carried secrets like small folded maps. There were nights she sat at the window and watched the street as if memorizing it. There were times when she would tuck a postcard into her pocket to prove she had visited a place without bringing up why. Elliot respected each motion. He had learned that trust is not demanded, but sewn in with patience. The moments that made their life domestic were unremarkable in their small bravery, drying a dish together and laughing at a drip, trimming a crooked hem until both of them squinted, a roof of steam over the soup in winter. Laya learned to thread a needle and, in return, learned to tell the truth without armor. Isabel learned to accept a bedtime story and to braid Laya's hair with slow, awkward tenderness. Then, in an ordinary afternoon, stitched into the habit of living, a stranger from Isabel's past arrived at the door, a messenger, not violent, but insistent, bearing a legal letter that asked questions they were not ready to answer. The envelope felt heavy in Elliot's hands, like a small stone. They sat at the kitchen table with the letter between them. Isabel read it twice, then folded it into a corner. She breathed and let the breath out. "They want to talk," she said, "about old contracts and investments. They want me to—" She stopped and shook her head as if to dislodge a bad thought. Elliot looked at Laya, who was busy placing stickers on a page and had not yet noticed the shift in the room's air. He felt a slow, cold line run through his stomach, the way weather can change before you notice clouds. The entire social machinery that had once come for Isabel could come again, and this time it might not be satisfied with a small circle of friends and soup. "We'll face it," Elliot said. The words were steadier than he felt. "We'll get help. We'll not let them come and take what matters." He did not know if his promise would hold. He only knew that refusing to say the words would have been a greater betrayal. Isabel nodded like someone accepting an offer to stand, not to be saved, but to be seen. She slipped the letter into her tote and ran her fingers along the frayed edge of the indigo strip framed beside the sink. "It's time I answered," she said. "Not for them, for me." Elliot felt something rise in him, protectiveness braided with the odd fear of being overprotective. He also felt a quiet pride that surprised him. This was not the kind of victory that came with trumpets, but the stubborn, ordinary success of someone choosing to step into the light. They made a plan that evening, a lawyer recommended by a neighbor, a public statement that corrected what needed correcting, a careful calendar. Laya insisted on adding a star sticker next to any appointment that seemed hard, as if marking bravery could make it easier. Isabel let her because rituals help you hold the world when it wants to tilt. When the day of the legal meeting came, Elliot wore a coat with patched elbows and a resolve shaped less by certainty than by the necessity of loving the people with him. They walked together to the office, a small family that moved awkwardly through the city's machines. No thunderclap arrived. Rather, a series of careful questions, a reading of documents, a clearing of some fog. By the time they reached the gallery that evening to see the smallest of Isabel's pieces displayed beside new work, there had been bruises, but also small clearances. People greeted them with curiosity rather than condemnation. Laya's poem had been shared on a community board and had more gently framed eyes looking their way.
Elliot watched Isabel stand under the gallery light, and for the first time he noticed the angle of her jaw in a way that suggested repair rather than protection. She touched the edge of a hem with reverence, as if the fabric remembered what it had been for, and the room watched her like a congregation. When they left that night, the city felt more humane. Snow had returned in a soft, forgiving way and dusted the sidewalks into a new, forgiving topography. Laya fell asleep in the stroller with her small mouth open in a dream, and Elliot carried her up the stairs as if he were carrying something ancient and delicate. At the door, before he unlocked it, Isabel stopped. She turned and looked at them both. "Thank you," she said, and the word was heavy with everything it had meant to hold out a hand and have it taken. Elliot nodded and hugged her as the key turned. Inside, they placed the framed indigo strip in a place where the morning light could find it, and Laya drew another picture, 3 stick figures, a heart, and this time flowers around the roof. It was not an end. It was a work in progress, stitches and soup and the small courage of showing up. Outside, the city continued to spin its complicated stories, and at the center of one small apartment, hands kept working, mending what could be mended. They were slow stitches, patient and honest, stitched into a life that would not be perfect, but would be kept. The next morning, Isabel woke early and set a kettle to boil. She began to sew with a deliberate care, the thread moving through cloth like a slow, steady breath. Laya arrived with a list of errands and a demand for pancakes, and Elliot read the paper for a few moments before folding it and setting it aside. He found a column that spoke abstractly about kindness, and found, in its small space, a warmth he had thought lost. There would be more days like this, days of small repairs, of legal meetings and interviews, of friends who asked awkward questions, and those who offered meals in unassuming ways. There would also be nights when Isabel wanted to leave again, and times when Elliot worried he had let Laya down by allowing the world to be complicated. But there would also be mornings when Laya would braid both their hair and call them family with straightforward conviction. On a quiet afternoon, as sunlight drew a pale stripe across the living room rug, Isabel brought out a small folded paper and handed it to Elliot. "They want me to show something at a community night," she said. "A small piece. Will you come?" Elliot looked at Laya first. She was embroidering a small star onto a cloth napkin and looked up with an intensity that anchored him. "Yes," he said, "we'll go." Isabel's hands trembled with a steadier tremor than before, one that suggested not flight but effort. She slipped the indigo scarf into a satchel and, as if to mark the moment, threaded a new tiny blue stitch into the hem of Laya's crown. They walked to the bus together, and at the corner where they first met, Laya stopped and looked at the empty bench. She put down a mitten like a marker, then took Isabel's hand and, with all the solemnity a child can muster, said once more, "I need a mommy, and you need a home." Isabel bent and kissed the top of her head.
and Elliot felt the world tilt again, this time towards something that might hold. They kept walking, the three of them in an ordinary narrative that had been rearranged by small kindnesses. Each step was a stitch, each meal a seam, and in the spaces between them, a new life was being sown, slowly but insistently, into being. It would not be easy, it would not be shiny, but it was theirs to keep working on. Outside, the snow softened to a mist, and the city's noise seemed to fold into the background. Inside, a kettle whistled, and hands moved, steady and real. The kettle kept singing until noon, until the apartment smelled of wet wool and lemon soap and something like possibility. Isabel folded the scarf once more, then twice, tracing its embroidered edge with a finger, as if rereading a sentence she had almost forgotten. Laya arranged a paper crown on a shelf, and then took it down again to add a loop of thread. "So it won't fall," she announced with grave authority. Elliot found a tin of mismatched buttons and set them on the table, a small constellation of colors. He stacked 2 plates and a bowl, and when Isabel glanced up, offered to drive them if she wanted. She shook her head, smiling at the offer the way people smile at generous weather, grateful and with no certainty it would hold. The community night was in a converted storefront on the edge of a neighborhood that had been breathed into life by people who did not expect monuments. The room where neighbors gathered was painted a calm gray and smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Folding chairs were set in semicircles. A low stage waited with a microphone on a stand and a table of refreshments at the back. Someone hung strings of warm bulbs like constellations that, unlike the city's neon, didn't try to shout. Isabel tucked the indigo strip into a flat portfolio and slid the satchel over her shoulder. On the street, they joined a stream of other bodies: lilac coats, heavy boots, a dog that added its own careful rhythm to the crowd. Laya skipped between puddles and left tiny footprints in the damp, and Elliot held Isabel's hand for the space between 2 crosswalks where cars let the world breathe for a moment. She squeezed his fingers and let go, then took Laya's mittened hand in a trinity of warmth. Inside, the community center felt like the inside of a well-kept story, faces unfamiliar until they looked up and became neighbors. Someone from the board, a woman with a name tag that read Marta, greeted Isabel with a professional tenderness and led her towards a wall where a dozen small works rested, descriptions written in careful block letters. The indigo strip was smaller than many pieces, and yet the blue gathered light differently, as if it had been waiting for this place to be given back to itself. Isabel stood near it and watched a woman with silver hair and paint-stained knuckles study the hem, as if she could read the motions threaded there. Elliot positioned himself in a chair near the back and, out of the corner of his eye, saw how Laya milled about like a small festival, trading stickers with a teenager at the refreshment table, offering conspiratorial advice to older attendees, and at one point holding a cup of cocoa with both hands and closing her eyes in solemn appreciation. When the evening began, one by one, voices and small flags of sound rose. Isabel felt it happen in a sequence she had practiced in the quiet of her head. A woman read a couple of poems about rent and sunlight. A man with a battered guitar sang a song about a train that never seemed to leave. Applause came like polite waves until the moment was hers. She had not chosen to speak much. The indigo worked like a slow speech, a sentence in cloth. Still, when Marta came to her and asked if she would say a few words about the piece, the room folded its attention toward her the way snow gathers on a sill. Isabel walked to the small stage with a steadiness that surprised her. The microphone made a small, unheroic sound when she tapped it. Someone adjusted the light so that the blue of the scarf looked almost like a shore. She thought of the apartment, of the way morning light had rested on the framed strip, of Laya's crooked drawings, and the bowl in the sink that had become a place where kindness could sit and cool. She thought, too, of the closets she had lived in, and the nights she had measured in the shallow currency of breath. But she did not tell the room that. Instead, she said quietly, "This was made for hands to rest in. It is for people to keep warm, to remember that someone spent time on the edge of another day." Her voice was not large, but it carried. People leaned forward in their chairs. A few smiled, as if they had been shown something private. An elderly man in the second row tapped his cane in kindness. When she unrolled the scarf at the edge of the stage, the indigo unfurled like a small map of a life. The stitching was irregular in places and razor-true in others. Someone chuckled softly, and a woman murmured the word "beautiful," as if it were a remedy. Elliot watched her and felt a strange authorization bloom, an approval that had nothing to do with certificates or law and everything to do with witnessing. He had seen her in kitchens and hospital corridors and in quiet conversations with social workers. He had watched her gather herself in the small, dark hours. Here, under the stringed bulbs, she was not escaping or defending, she was showing. The act of making had shifted into the act of offering. Afterwards, people came by the wall and touched the fabric with respectful fingers. A mother asked where Laya had learned to embroider. A teenager wanted to know if Isabel sold scarves. Isabel answered each question with an economy that felt like honesty. Someone asked if the piece had a name. Isabel thought for a moment, and then, because names had been given to her by maps and by arrival, said softly, "Homestitch." There was, of course, a moment where the past nudged itself forward. A man who had spoken earlier, a thin face, a familiarity that made the back of Isabel's neck rise, stood near the doorway with a puzzled expression. He asked a question with too much curiosity about provenance and paperwork, and the words carried the sound of someone inquiring whether all was in order. His interest felt like a ledger being opened, a space where trust might be counted in columns. Isabel answered with the same composed honesty she had used before, and though the man listened without malice, his attention left a small, cold place where she had to remind herself to breathe. Laya, noticing the man's concentration, marched over and, in a child's merciless economy of comfort, dropped a paper star into his hand. "This is for you," she said with absolute faith. The man, taken off balance, looked at the star and then at Laya and at Isabel, and the ledger closed like a book that has been reset by an unexpected kindness. He smiled, small and surprised, and then he left with the rest of the crowd. It felt, in that private way, like a blessing. By the time they walked home, the air had cooled, and the city had settled into a hush that belonged to late hours and the small epiphanies of people who had spent an evening being more human to each other. Isabel carried the indigo close to her chest. Laya hummed a song she had heard earlier and skipped on the curb. Elliot held the stroller, now empty, with the habit of use. At their door, they paused. Isabel opened the satchel and found, tucked into a corner where she had not left it, a folded business card from the silver-haired painter who had studied her work. Marta had introduced them briefly. The card read, simply, "If you'd like to show more, we have a small spot next month. M." Isabel looked at Elliot. There was a way in which the card was only paper, and yet the paper had the gravity of an invitation. She thought of the small repair shop where someone might cake a piece and make it something that could buy a week of groceries. She thought, too, of the time it would take to stitch and to gather, to explain to Laya why sometimes a parent wasn't at home because they were working through a thing. Elliot squeezed her hand and slipped her the keys to their apartment, as if to say, "Keep making." They ate soup on mismatched plates, and Laya, finger-streaked, decided that the indigo would be part of a show and tell the next day at her preschool. "So they can see my mommy's magic," she told the table, solemnly.